Howdy, and welcome to Chapter 3. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about how we conduct a goal analysis. If you recall the Dick and Carey model, we started at step 1, where we assessed the needs. So we had to determine whether there was an issue or problem that could be solved by training or instruction. Once we do that, we identify a goal. We come up with a goal statement that describes the behavior that the learner will be doing once they meet, the goal of the training. So the second step after that is to conduct the instructional analysis, and that's where we are in Chapter 3. So an instructional analysis is a set of procedures that, when applied to an instructional goal, remember we defined the goal in step 1, identifies the relevant steps for performing the goal and the subordinate skills required for the learner to achieve the goal. So this has two steps to it. So Chapter 3 will talk about goal analysis, and in Chapter 4 we'll talk about the sub-skills. So goal analysis has two major steps. The first one is to classify the goal statement. After we do that, then we identify and sequence the major steps required to perform the goal. So we've talked before about Gagne and how Gagne's had just a huge impact on instructional design. Part of his impact was to come up with the 4 domains of learning. The first domain is verbal. So what we'll do, we'll take an instructional goal and we'll decide which of these domains does the goal fall under. Okay, so the first one that Gagne identifies is verbal skills. So there are many ways to teach a skill, and there are several ways the learner might try to learn it. However, with verbal, there's only one answer for each question and one basic way to answer each question. And we can spot a verbal goal very easily by the verbs that are used, because it'll state the learner must state, the learner must list, the learner must describe. Here in this example, the learner must name the countries in Europe. Okay, so it's assumed that the information to be stated or listed is going to be taught by the instructor in the training. And the task is for the learner to store that information in their memory during the instruction and then remember it later, when prompted to do so. The next domain is intellectual skills. Okay, and most instruction created by designers is meant to solve problems, and solving problems is an intellectual skill. So these are skills that require cognitive activity. They're unique in the sense that the learner must be able to solve a problem or perform an activity with previously unencountered information. So it requires a lot of cognitive type activity to do this. 4 ways of this happening. One is making discriminations, forming concepts, applying rules, and solving problems, whether they be well-structured or ill-structured. So with these skills, the learner can classify things according to labels and characteristics, apply a rule, and select and apply various rules then to solve the problem. So the goal requires the learner to manipulate symbolic information in some way. So that's what makes it an intellectual skill. So when you think about it, an example of this may be teaching a learner how to balance a checkbook, or teaching a learner how to solve a statistics problem. Okay, so these are things that require cognitive activity. The learner has to figure it out. Okay, the third domain of learning is psychomotor. And this is a coordination of mental and physical activity. Okay, so it requires that the learner exert some kind of physical action. It could be with or without equipment, and this is to achieve some sort of results. So in some situations, there could be a lot of psycho in it, or mental activity involved. Okay, so the thing about this is that the learner has to do something physically that more than likely requires some sort of high level intellectual skills as well. So, putting a golf ball would be a good example of a psychomotor activity. Um, to me, I don't play golf, but it looks easy, but it's really not. It takes a lot of coordination and mental, thought and that sort of thing. So that would be a psychomotor goal. Okay, the last one is attitudes. Okay, an attitude is a kind of strange sort of goal because the learner has to choose to do this. So it's very hard to train somebody in making them want to choose something. Okay, so it does require some sort of a cognitive type activity, usually, um, but mainly it's a choice whether to do something. Okay, so they have to decide: do they choose to be a good employee? Do they choose to eat good food? Do they choose to get enough sleep? I mean, these are things we choose. Or this example, choose to recycle. So when we identify an attitudinal goal, we determine whether the learners have to make a choice and whether the goal indicates the direction in which the decisions to be influenced. So in this case, choose to recycle would be a goal, attitudinal goal. Okay, so the first step in goal analysis is we take our instructional goal developed in the first part and we classify it according to one of these 4 areas. And some goals could be a little bit of one and a lot of another. So we're going to look at these and say, okay, our goal is mainly intellectual, okay, or mainly verbal. So the second step is to identify and sequence the major steps required to perform the goal. And this is called goal analysis. So in goal analysis, we're creating a visual display of the steps the learner would do when performing the instructional goal. And we show this as a diagram. We show this as a flow chart. So in the first one, this shows a sequential goal. So the learner would do step 1, and then they'd move on to step 2, to step 3, to step 4, to step 5. In the bottom one, there's a decision to be made. So the learner would do step 1 and then step 2, and then they would ask a question. Is this way or that way? If the answer is yes, then the learner completes step 4 and then step 5. If the answer is no, the learner completes step 6 and step 7. So the idea is to show what the learner will actually be doing when performing the goal. So these are the steps of performing the goal. Here's a little video showing how this is done. So let's take a look at this for a minute.
Instructional Analysis Part 2. In this presentation, I'll show an example of how I would begin to brainstorm and lay out an analysis of an intellectual skill. And in the previous presentation, we looked at a psychomotor skill. So here is the example we'll be going with. Customer service representatives will employ the service call strategy on a customer service phone call. So remember what the components of our analysis are going to be here. We've got the instructional goal. This is already here. We've got it. But we also want to do our goal analysis, our subordinate skill analysis, and our entry skills. So let's start looking at the instructional goal analysis. And remember, once again, this is not a perfect science. I'm just sort of making this up and brainstorming what I think would be good for this. Again, as you do this, it'll be iterative. It'll take several attempts, several drafts before you feel like you're really getting to where you want to be. So let's go ahead here. So I'm going to say for our instructional goal of the reps using the service call strategy, let's start out here and we'll say that they need to answer the call using the call opening. So that's our first step. Now, once they've done that, they really need to do, I think what they should do is discover the needs. So discover the needs of the customer. That's really an important step. So after they figure out what the needs of the customer are, the next step then is they have got to make a decision. So they need to discover whether or not they can fulfill the need of the customer. So I'm going to say, can you fulfill the need? That's our yes or no decision here. So if no, then they probably need to transfer the call to somebody who can actually help the customer. But if they can, if it's a yes, then we can say, answer their question. Okay? Now, once they answer the question, a next step is to go ahead and close the call. That's our final step. So this is my draft of our instructional goal analysis. Now, even now as I look at this, it's not perfect because can you fulfill the needs? If it's a no, maybe they would need to transfer the call, but they might need to also just tell them, hey, we don't have that information, or hey, I can't do that request for you. So that might not work. And sometimes answering the question is not the only thing you need to do. Maybe there's some other action that needs to be taken. So I can already tell that this isn't a perfect instructional goal analysis, but it's a start. So what would I do next? Well, I might just redo this. I might go ahead and adjust it and change it. I might show it to somebody else and say, okay, what am I missing here? Let's sort of fix this up. I really want to just give it several iterations until I feel like I'm getting close to what I need. But this is my start. Okay, so let's do a subordinate skills analysis for...
Okay, I'm going to stop it there because Chapter 4 will cover the subordinate skills and entry skills. But you can see how he kind of roughed out this diagram. And like he said, it's not final because as new things come to mind, we go back and we change this and we refine it until we're sure that we, in fact, have the steps that we need. And normally in an instructional analysis, you have between 5 and 15 steps for a 1 to 2 hour instruction. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. 5 to 15 is normally what we would do. Okay, so performing an instructional goal analysis, if we have an intellectual or psychomotor skill, how would we do that? We kind of lump them together because psychomotor has that part in it that's intellectual. So we handle those in the same manner. So we would describe step by step what the learner will be doing. Okay, the learner does this, and they do this, and they do this. So very important, the second point, the statement of each step must include a verb that describes an observable behavior. So the steps have to describe observable behavior, something that we can visualize, something that, the learner, we can actually see the learner do. We can't use words like the learner will know the procedure because we can't tell by looking at someone what they know. Okay, what would they be doing if they knew the procedure? Those are the steps. Okay, and each step should have an observable outcome. Okay, and here's an example. So the goal is we want the learner to determine the distance between specified cities and towns on a state map. Okay, so we start by estimating the size of the population, classifying large centers as cities and small centers as towns. So here's a classification that's an intellectual kind of skill. And then we have a decision. Are all specified places major cities? If yes, then we have a mileage table we can use. Okay, that would be step 4. If no, if we have some cities that aren't major cities, then we have to go to more of a manual process, and that's what the rest of this analysis takes you through. Okay, so that would be for an intellectual. Psychomotor would happen in the same way. Okay, so next we have a verbal goal. So a verbal goal, we have to understand what the learner will be doing. Are they listing, naming, describing something? And there's no sequence for these steps because we're asking the learner to memorize something and tell us what they have memorized. Okay, so we have to organize it somehow. So a common way to do that is from easy to complex or familiar to non-familiar. Okay, so in this example, this is a verbal skill where we want the learner to describe the 5 parts of a material safety data sheet, and that's an OSHA requirement. So we just want them, we don't want them really to do anything, but we want them to tell us these things. So you notice the steps don't have arrows because they're not really sequential. We're just asking people to describe things. Describe fire and explosion hazard data. Describe the reactivity data, so on and so forth. So we're just asking them to be able to describe the parts of the material safety data sheet and what's in those parts. Okay? So then we have the attitudinal goal, which is always, like I said, a little bit weird and different. So we have to identify the behavior. So an attitudinal goal could be intellectual, psychomotor, could be verbal. So it depends which it is. So we just follow what we just said. Like if my attitudinal goal is intellectual or psychomotor, I follow the previous chart, which was this one. Okay, if it's verbal, I kind of go with this sort of an analysis. Okay, so here's an example of an attitudinal goal. The goal is to choose to maximize personal safety while staying at a hotel. So we have to demonstrate fire safety precautions while staying in a hotel. And we know it's an attitudinal goal. That's why we put this A in a circle, and we put what it is we want them to change, what behavior. We want them to choose to follow fire safety precautions. Okay, so that's how we tell. This is the format for an attitudinal goal. And then it kind of, after that, looks like our intellectual goal. We have steps. We determine the hotel's fire safety procedures and check-in. Then we identify emergency facilities in the hotel room, so on and so forth. Okay, so that would be an attitudinal goal. So some things to watch out for when we're doing this process. This does require a designer to have extensive knowledge about the goal. Okay, and if the designer does not, then they go get a subject matter expert, somebody who does know, because this is very detailed. These are the detailed steps of what someone will do to carry out the goal. So most times when I've done this, I've had to go get somebody to do this. For instance, when I was asked to do forklift training, I really didn't know much about how to drive a forklift, so I had to work with a subject matter expert that could tell me, oh, you do this, you check this, you do this, so that I made sure that my content was correct. Okay, so we oftentimes have to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, trainers and designers aren't expected to know everything about everything. Okay. Secondly, that novice designers tend to list the steps followed in teaching rather than the steps the learner goes through to perform the goal. And this happens so often that we tend to describe how we're going to train somebody, rather than what they're doing after the training. This is still in the performance context. This is not the training context. But for instance, if I was talking about the forklift example, I could say, well, I'm going to show a video of how to safely drive a forklift. I'm going to have a demonstration where I take them out and show them the parts of the forklift. I'm going to have a matching quiz where they match the parts of the forklift with the definitions. See, that's the steps of training. That's not what the person will be doing after the training. After the training would look something like, check the brakes of the forklift, make sure the propane tank is on, make sure the fuel level is at blah, 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 whatever. You kind of get the idea. Okay, then the third issue is sometimes we want to include skills we like but aren't really required to perform the goal. So this is just a matter of maybe being too close to it and going, oh, I really like this particular thing and I'm going to put that in there when it's really not necessary to the goal. So we have to be just mindful and careful of our biases or our likes and dislikes and that sort of thing and our limitations. Okay? So this is from the book. This is a rubric for evaluating a goal analysis. And you can look this over. So if I have my goal analysis, I can go through here and kind of check things. Are things clear? Is it focused? Do I have the right kind of diagramming going on? Okay, so just a guide, just to let you know it's there. So that's really all I have for this chapter, But just for fun, why don't you do this? We do this in class, but why don't you do this just for fun? Think of a psychomotor goal and come up with 5 or more steps that are observable, and it's always fun to come up with something you actually know how to do, like bake a cake. What are the steps to bake a cake? Well, if it were me, I'd have to go to HEB and buy the ingredients. I would have to gather my bowls and utensils. I would have to preheat the oven, so on and so forth. This is kind of fun to do this just to see how that works and come up with one where you have to do a yes or no. That would be kind of fun too. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed chapter 3. Thank you.